It was a Monday morning like any other, coffee half made, my husband Daniel already dressed for work, when we heard the knock. Two firm raps, then a pause, then two more. I remember it so precisely because I'd been standing at the kitchen counter, half listening to the local news playing quietly on the small speaker we kept by the toaster, thinking about nothing more urgent than whether we had enough eggs for the week or whether I needed to swing by the store on my way home from my own office later that afternoon. The knock cut through that ordinary domestic quiet in a way that immediately felt wrong, too deliberate, too patterned to be a neighbor or a delivery. I remember thinking it was probably a delivery, except we hadn't ordered anything, and delivery drivers don't usually knock twice, don't usually pause between knocks like they're waiting for something specific to happen on the other side of the door. Daniel was in the bathroom finishing up, and I called out to him, "Someone's at the door," in the same unremarkable tone I might have used to mention the weather, having absolutely no sense yet of what was about to unfold in our living room. I opened the door to find two people in plain clothes, unremarkable jackets, sensible shoes. Nothing about their appearance suggesting anything beyond ordinary visitors, except for the way they both stood with a kind of alert stillness that felt immediately different from the posture of anyone selling something or collecting for charity. The woman held up a badge before either of them said a word, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this exact motion hundreds of times before, a small leather case flipping open to reveal gold and blue, official in a way that made my pulse quicken even before I fully processed what I was looking at. "Mrs. Ellison? I'm Detective Ramirez. This is Detective Cole. Do you have a few minutes? We need to talk to you and your husband." My stomach dropped immediately, the way it does when you sense something is about to reorganize your entire day, maybe your entire week, maybe something even larger than that, though I had no way of knowing yet just how much larger. I stood there for a moment too long, processing the words, processing the badge, processing the fact that two detectives were standing on our porch on a completely unremarkable Monday morning asking to speak with both of us specifically, by name, as though they'd done their research before ever knocking. "Is everything okay?" I finally managed, my voice coming out smaller than I intended, already bracing myself for news about a family member, an accident, something terrible that had happened to someone we loved rather than something that concerned us directly. "We'd rather explain everything once we're all sitting down, if that's all right," Detective Ramirez said, her tone measured, careful in a way that struck me even then as deliberately calibrated to avoid alarming me any more than necessary, though the effort itself only heightened my anxiety rather than easing it. Daniel came up behind me a moment later, tie half knotted around his neck, one hand still smoothing down his hair from getting ready, and I watched his expression shift from mild curiosity about who was at the door to something more guarded the instant he saw the badge in Ramirez's hand. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice carrying that particular note of forced calm men sometimes adopt when they're trying to project steadiness for the benefit of whoever's watching, even as something tightens visibly around their eyes. "We need a few minutes of your time," Cole said again, gesturing slightly toward the interior of our house. "It would be better to discuss this inside, if you don't mind." The four of us ended up in our living room a minute later, the detective sitting across from us on the couch we usually reserved for guests we actually knew, the good couch, the one with decorative pillows my sister had given us as a housewarming gift years earlier, pillows that suddenly felt absurdly cheerful given the tension building in the room. I sat beside Daniel on the smaller love seat across from them, close enough that our knees touched, close enough that I could feel him go rigid beside me as the detective settled in, notebooks appearing from jacket pockets, the whole scene taking on the surreal, procedural quality of something I'd only ever encountered on television, never imagining it might one day happen in my own living room on a Monday before either of us had even left for work. "We're going to be direct with you," Detective Ramirez said, glancing briefly at her partner before continuing, some silent exchange passing between them that suggested they'd discussed exactly how to open this conversation before ever arriving at our door. "We have reason to believe you may be in danger. Both of you." Daniel let out a short laugh, the kind people make when they think they've misheard something, a reflexive, nervous sound rather than genuine amusement. "Danger from what? We haven't done anything. We don't even know anyone who—" He stopped himself mid-sentence, something flickering across his face that I couldn't quite identify in that moment, though I'd have plenty of time to think back on it later. "This isn't about anything you've done," Detective Cole said, cutting in gently but firmly, his voice carrying the particular patience of someone accustomed to delivering unsettling news to people who desperately wanted a different explanation than the one being offered. It's about someone else. Do either of you know a man named Victor Holloway? The name meant absolutely nothing to me, sitting there turning it over in my mind, searching through every acquaintance, every distant coworker, every name I could recall from the last several years of our lives together, coming up entirely blank. I watched Daniel's face carefully as the detective spoke, some instinct making me turn toward him rather than immediately answer myself, and for a second, just a flicker, something passed behind his eyes before he shook his head, a small, tight movement that felt, even then, slightly too deliberate.
"No," he said.
"Should I?" Ramirez studied him for a moment longer, then felt comfortable before continuing, her gaze steady in a way that made me wonder, uncomfortably, whether she'd noticed the same flicker I had, whether some part of her professional training had already clocked something in Daniel's response that the rest of us in the room hadn't fully registered yet. 2 weeks ago, we arrested a man in connection with a string of break-ins targeting financial consultants and their families across 3 counties, she said, opening her notebook to a page marked with a small paperclip. During the investigation, we found a notebook in his possession. Names, addresses, daily routines, work schedules, even notes about vehicles and license plates in some cases. Yours were in it. I felt the air leave the room entirely, my hand finding Daniel's without conscious thought, gripping it tightly enough that I felt him flinch slightly. Why would he have our information? I asked, my voice climbing higher than I intended, panic beginning to override the careful composure I'd been trying to maintain since opening the front door. Daniel's an accountant, not some kind of... I didn't even know how to finish that sentence. Didn't know what category of person I'd been about to suggest he wasn't. Only that whatever this was, it felt impossibly disconnected from the quiet, orderly life we'd built together over the past several years. We're still working that out, Cole said, his tone carefully neutral, giving nothing away about whatever theories they might already be forming. But we take this seriously enough that we wanted you informed immediately, before we'd even fully confirmed every detail, because we'd rather you have time to take precautions than wait until we had every answer. Daniel had gone very quiet beside me, quieter than the situation alone seemed to warrant, staring down at his own hands where they rested on his knees, and something about that particular quality of silence, so unlike his usual response to stress, made my own fear sharpen into something closer to suspicion, a small, cold thread of doubt working its way through the panic, wondering exactly what memory had flickered behind his eyes when the detective first said that unfamiliar name. After the detectives left that first visit, promising to follow up within a day or 2 once they had more information, the house felt different in a way I couldn't quite articulate, too quiet, too exposed, every window suddenly seeming like it faced outward into a world I no longer fully trusted. I turned to Daniel in our now unnervingly empty living room and asked him directly, unable to hold the question in any longer. "You know something. I saw your face when they said his name." He didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that I felt my stomach twist further, watching him stand up from the love seat and walk toward the window, peering out through the curtains at our ordinary, sunlit street, as though checking whether the detective's car had actually pulled away or whether this entire morning might still turn out to be some elaborate misunderstanding. "Daniel." He rubbed his hands over his face, sat down heavily on the arm of the couch, the springs creaking slightly under him, and finally exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry 2 years of unspoken tension along with it. There was a client, 2 years ago. A man who wanted me to help him move money in ways I wasn't comfortable with, structuring transactions specifically to avoid reporting thresholds, breaking up large transfers into smaller ones designed to stay under the radar. I refused. I told him I wouldn't do it, that it wasn't something I was willing to put my license behind, and he didn't take it well. What does that mean, he didn't take it well? He got aggressive about it. Not physically, not in the room, but there was a tone that shifted, something in the way he talked about knowing people, about how refusing him would be a mistake I'd regret. I didn't think much of it beyond a vague unease, honestly, because clients say things like that sometimes when they're frustrated, when they're used to getting their way, and suddenly aren't. I reported the whole interaction to my firm's compliance department the same week, filed the paperwork, flagged the account, and never heard anything further about it. I never thought about it again, not until just now. Was his name Victor Holloway?
No.
Different name entirely. But he paused, working through something, his eyes moving rapidly the way they did when he was doing complicated math in his head, tracing connections I couldn't yet see. The notebook, the addresses, the timing of all this. It might not be about that specific person directly. It might be about the firm more broadly. I've handled a few accounts over the years that raised flags. Not just that one client, a handful of others where something felt off enough that I either declined the work outright or reported concerns up the chain. People who didn't like being told no, who maybe remembered exactly which analyst had refused them and held on to that. I felt sick, thinking about every ordinary Tuesday I'd spent gardening in our front yard in full view of the street, every window left unlocked on warm evenings because we lived, or thought we lived, in a quiet enough neighborhood that it never occurred to us to worry, every routine detail of our lives apparently laid bare for someone to catalog without our knowledge, which grocery store I favored, what time Daniel usually left for work, the fact that I ran most mornings along the same wooded path behind our subdivision. None of it had felt like information before that morning. Now it felt like an inventory someone else had compiled while we went about our lives completely unaware. "Why didn't you ever mention this to me?" I asked, not accusatory exactly, more disoriented, trying to understand how something significant enough to eventually bring detectives to our door had existed for 2 years without my ever knowing about it. "Because it felt handled," he said, and I could hear the frustration in his own voice now, directed as much at himself as at the situation. "I did what I was supposed to do. I refused the work, I reported it, compliance took it from there, and as far as I knew, that was the end of it. It wasn't the kind of thing that felt worth worrying you over at the time. People make idle threats when they're angry about losing business." I genuinely believed that's all it was. The detectives came back 2 days later, sooner than they'd initially indicated, which itself felt like an ominous sign before either of them said a single word. They sat in the same spots on our couch, notebooks out again, and this time Ramirez opened with more information rather than more questions. "Victor Holloway, it turns out, wasn't the mastermind at all," she said. "Just a hired hand working for someone higher up, someone the notebook referred to only by initials scattered throughout the pages, someone who appears to have been targeting financial professionals who'd refused to cooperate with certain schemes over the past several years. We believe he's been compiling this information not just as a warning system, but potentially as leverage or, more concerning, as preparation." "Preparation for what?" I asked, though some part of me already dreaded the answer. "We can't be entirely certain yet," Cole said carefully, "but the level of detail in the notebook, the routines, the vehicle information, the daily patterns tracked over weeks in some cases, suggests something beyond simple burglary. We believe the intent may have shifted from information gathering to something more direct." Daniel gripped my hand tightly as she spoke, his knuckles whitening slightly, and I realized, watching him, that whatever guilt he'd been carrying about the refused client from 2 years earlier wasn't really guilt at all, or wasn't only guilt. It was fear, plain and simple, the same fear now sitting heavy and cold in my own chest, spreading through me as I thought about how thin the walls of our ordinary life had turned out to be, how easily something from years ago could resurface and reshape everything we'd built since. "We'd recommend a change in your daily routine for the time being," Ramirez continued, watching our reactions carefully. "Varying your routes to work, being cautious about who has access to your schedule, limiting what you share publicly, including on social media if either of you post regularly. And we'd like to install some additional security measures at the house, with your permission, cameras, sensors on the doors and windows, that sort of thing, at least until we have a clearer picture of exactly who we're dealing with and how immediate the threat actually is." "Do it," Daniel said immediately, no hesitation at all, his voice firmer than it had been all morning, some protective instinct clearly overriding whatever shame he might have felt about the situation originating, at least in part, from a decision he'd made 2 years earlier, without ever imagining it would follow us home like this. "Whatever you need to do, we'll cooperate completely." I nodded beside him, still processing the shape of everything unfolding around us, still trying to reconcile the ordinary Monday morning I'd woken up expecting with the version of our life we now seemed to be living, one where strangers had apparently been watching our house, tracking our habits, deciding what to do with the information they'd gathered. All while Daniel and I remained completely oblivious, going about our days exactly as we always had, never once suspecting that our ordinary caution wasn't nearly enough. The following weeks blurred into a strange new normal, security cameras installed along our porch and driveway within 2 days of that second visit. A technician from a private firm the detectives recommended working methodically around our property while I hovered nearby, unable to focus on anything else, watching him mount small black devices above the garage, near the back door, angled toward the side gate that led to our fenced yard. Daniel took the day off work to be present for the installation, something he almost never did, and I remember thinking how strange it was to watch him standing in our driveway in jeans and a t-shirt on a Wednesday morning, discussing camera angles with a stranger, when just days earlier our biggest concern had been whether the dishwasher needed repair. A patrol car occasionally idled at the end of our street during evening hours, something Detective Ramirez had arranged through her department as an extra precaution while the investigation continued, and though I understood intellectually that it was meant to be reassuring, I found myself instead watching for it anxiously each night, feeling a fresh spike of unease on the nights it didn't appear at its usual time, wondering whether that meant something had shifted, whether the danger had escalated, or simply whether the officer assigned had been pulled to a different call. Daniel and I both varied our routines in small, careful ways the detectives had suggested, checking mirrors more than we used to on our drives to work, taking different routes on alternating days, even though it added 10 minutes to an already long commute, texting each other the moment we arrived anywhere significant, a habit that felt paranoid at first and then simply became the fabric of how we moved through our days. I stopped running my usual morning route through the wooded path behind our subdivision, switching instead to a treadmill in our garage that we'd bought years earlier and barely used, running in place while staring out at the same driveway now monitored by 3 separate cameras, feeling both safer and more suffocated than I ever had in my own home. We told almost no one what was happening, not our families, not our closest friends, partly on the detective's advice to limit who knew our situation while the investigation remained active, and partly because neither of us knew how to explain it in a way that didn't sound like something out of a television drama, some implausible plot neither of us could quite believe we were actually living through. My sister called one evening during that period, chatting about ordinary things, a dinner party she was planning, and I found myself giving vague, distracted answers, acutely aware of everything I couldn't say, feeling the strange isolation of carrying something this large without being able to share the weight of it with anyone outside our own 4 walls. Daniel changed too, in ways I noticed slowly over those weeks. He'd always been a light sleeper, but now I'd wake at 2 or 3 in the morning to find him standing at our bedroom window, just watching the street, not doing anything in particular, just watching. He started double-checking the door locks obsessively, something he'd never cared about before, testing each one twice even after I'd already confirmed them locked. I caught him once, standing in his home office late at night, going back through old client files from years earlier, cross-referencing names against something on his laptop screen, searching, I realized, for any other person who might have reason to want him watched, tracked, cataloged the way Victor Holloway's notebook had apparently cataloged us. "You can't fix this by finding every possible name," I told him gently one night, finding him hunched over his desk well past midnight, eyes bloodshot from staring at spreadsheets. "The detectives are working on it. That's their job now, not yours." "I keep thinking if I'd just handled it differently 2 years ago," he said, not looking up from the screen. "If I'd been less direct, if I'd found a way to decline the work without making him angry, without giving him a reason to remember my name specifically enough to have someone track our address." "You did the right thing," I said, sitting on the arm of his chair, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You refused to help someone launder money, or whatever it actually was. That's not a mistake, Daniel. That's exactly what you were supposed to do." He didn't fully believe me. Not yet. Not during those weeks when the danger still felt entirely unresolved, hanging over both of us like weather we couldn't predict or control. But he stopped going back through old files after that conversation, at least stopped doing it in front of me, and I chose not to ask whether he continued the search privately. understanding that he needed some way to process the helplessness of the situation even if it wasn't especially productive. 3 weeks after that first knock on our door, on another ordinary Monday that felt almost cruelly symmetrical given how everything had started, Detective Cole called with an update, his voice carrying a different quality than it had during our previous conversations, something closer to relief, mixed with the careful professionalism he'd maintained throughout. "We made an arrest this morning," he said. "The man behind the initials in Victor Holloway's notebook. Someone connected to a financial fraud ring that's been under investigation for over a year now, longer than your case specifically, involving several other companies across the region beyond just your husband's firm." I sat down heavily at our kitchen table, phone pressed hard against my ear, motioning frantically for Daniel to come listen, my hands shaking slightly as Cole continued explaining. The man, it turned out, ran an operation that had been quietly coercing and threatening financial professionals for nearly 3 years, using compiled personal information as leverage to either force cooperation or, in cases where professionals like Daniel refused and reported the interaction, marking them as liabilities to be monitored and, in a handful of documented instances across the broader investigation, targeted more directly through break-ins meant to intimidate or retrieve sensitive financial documents. Daniel's refusal, it turned out, had been noted in far more detail than either of us had imagined, flagged not just as a lost business opportunity, but discussed, according to communications the investigators had recovered, as a genuine liability, someone whose compliance report could potentially expose parts of the broader operation if it ever drew enough regulatory attention. Our names had ended up on a list of people considered problems to be managed rather than simply persuaded, a distinction that Cole explained carefully, understanding, I think, how much weight that particular detail carried for both of us. "You did the right thing reporting him," I told Daniel that night, both of us sitting on our porch in the fading evening light, watching the new camera's small red light blink steadily near the doorframe, the patrol car parked at its usual spot down the street for what we now understood would be one of its final nights of scheduled presence. Even though it put us in this position, even though it took 2 years to catch up with us. "I know," he said quietly, staring out at the yard, at the ordinary summer evening unfolding around us, kids riding bikes further down the street, a neighbor watering her garden, life continuing exactly as it always had for everyone except us. Doesn't make it feel less terrifying, knowing how close it got before we even had a chance to protect ourselves. Knowing they'd been watching us for who knows how long before Holloway ever got arrested and that notebook turned up. The detectives assured us the immediate danger had passed once the arrest was made, the network largely dismantled according to the broader investigation, several other arrests following in the weeks after Cole's initial call as the full scope of the operation came into focus. They recommended we keep some of the security measures in place for at least a few more months out of caution, standard practice, Ramirez explained, until the case moved fully through prosecution and any remaining associates had been identified and addressed. Slowly, our routines began settling back into something resembling normal. I returned to running my old path through the woods behind our subdivision, tentatively at first, testing whether the fear had actually loosened its grip or whether I was simply performing normalcy for my own benefit. Daniel stopped checking the locks twice, mostly, though I noticed he still paused at our bedroom window some nights before finally settling into sleep, some new watchfulness that I suspected might never fully disappear. We kept the cameras. Even months later, once the investigation had concluded and Cole had called one final time to let us know the last of the associated arrests had been made, neither of us seriously discussed removing them, some quiet agreement passing between us that the small measure of visible security was worth keeping, a permanent adjustment to how we lived rather than a temporary precaution we'd eventually shed. Looking back, I think about that Monday morning constantly, the 2 firm knocks that split our life into a clear before and after, the ordinary coffee going cold on the counter, while our understanding of our own safety quietly unraveled in real time across our living room couch. We'd built an entire existence assuming our ordinary caution, our locked doors and reasonable routines, was enough to keep us safe, never imagining that safety could be undone by a single refused handshake 2 years earlier, a decision Daniel had made quietly and correctly, never expecting it to follow us home the way it eventually did. Never expecting that doing the right thing could come with a cost neither of us saw coming until two detectives stood on our porch and told us, as gently as such news can ever be delivered, that we were in danger.